Welcome back. You're watching Today, and we all know that the COVID-19 pandemic affected most industries negatively, including the entertainment and media space. Well, the forecast looks very positive, though, and that's despite the high cost of living. The entertainment and media revenue is expected to increase to over 2 billion by 2027. For more on this discussion, we're joined by Charles Stuart from PwC, South Africa's entertainment and media space, a partner there. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Charles. And it's a very interesting report that's been put out by PwC because it gives a great sense of the trends and the regions that we are going to see the biggest pockets of growth. So maybe start with sharing that for our viewers as to what we're seeing after the peak of the pandemic and the countries that are probably going to benefit the most from growth in E&M.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, and good afternoon to all of your viewers. So from an overall market perspective, reviewer, we are definitely seeing a stabilization of growth. The theme for our outlook this year was around resetting expectations. And we had seen growth in 2021, to your point earlier, really sort of rebound strongly. So we had seen growth of around 15.4% in 2021. That stabilized to around 8.8% in 2022. And over our forecast period, we are seeing that growth becoming a little bit more muted at 5.5%, and that'll see the overall market growing from around 177 billion rand, which it is this year, in 2022, through to around 231 billion in 2027. In terms of the sectors that are going to gain the most over that period, internet access is going to add about 33 billion rands worth of spend, internet advertising about 10 billion, and then we see fairly equal gains in spend across OTT, video games, TV, and then music, and particularly music streaming within that space. So your digitally inclined segments are certainly going to be the winners over the forecast period.
Yeah, and I mean, the report has identified countries like Nigeria and Kenya as those that will see the most growth in E&M. And give us a sense as to why that is. Is there a greater consumption of the different bits of entertainment and media on all platforms, or are they the big creators of this content?
So a lot of that growth is obviously linked to the level of internet penetration that we see within those markets. Yeah. So you're 100% correct. Nigeria is going to be one of the fastest growing markets in the world, right? Actually, the fastest growing market at around 16.5% per annum through to 2027. Most of that growth is going to come in the internet access space. So currently, they only have around 25% mobile internet penetration in Nigeria, and that's going to grow to around 32%, which is not a massive percentage growth, but obviously when you take their very large population into account, that's a lot of people coming online in Nigeria and then starting to consume some of that digital content. In Kenya, that's forecast to grow from around $2.3 billion to around $3.2 billion, so that's a 7% growth rate. And the majority of that growth is going to be driven by their internet advertising. They have the fastest internet advertising growth rate in the world at just over 19%. So those are really the sectors that are gaining in those two markets, and it's exciting for Africa. Obviously, as more people come online, so we see more of the content come online, and as more content comes online, and you get greater e-commerce, so you get this virtuous circle of more people coming online to obviously consume and interact with that content.
Stuart, it's very interesting because obviously that means there's been quite a bit of innovation and creativity around the thinking and placing of content on these digital spaces, and on obviously giving people internet connectivity, because when you look at it at a glance, you think there's the energy crisis and there's the digital divide, and yet here we're seeing this growth on the digital platforms. Tell us about that innovation and creativity that we are seeing, that people can actually access this bit of content via the internet.
So I think people are interacting. Obviously, we are seeing rapid growth in terms of the deployment of 5G. So globally, we see that 5G is going to overtake 4G in 2025. We don't quite get to that position from a South Africa perspective until after the forecast period. So in 2027, we're going to have around 47 million 4G connections, still in around 43 million 5G connections. So we're almost at that same tipping point. People are obviously upgrading their smartphones. Their smartphones are becoming really that device of choice. And when we look at the prevalence of what people are using to access that content, it's very much right across Africa a mobile-first story. If we look at what's happening within that space and some of the innovation, we are seeing that companies are having to pivot a little bit. So we haven't got an ad-supported tier of Netflix that's been released in South Africa yet, but we are seeing around the globe, businesses are going to have to pivot between maybe their traditional sort of business models, where they maybe had a subscription-based service. And now we're seeing that, one of the fastest growing elements within the OTT streaming space is actually in the ad-supported video on demand space. And why? Exactly to your point earlier, we have this cost of living crisis. You can't eat entertainment and media. And so businesses are having to figure out where else they can find that revenue from, and are then pivoting into ad-supported revenue models to be able to achieve that.
Yeah, ad support, video on demand. What about the music streaming component here? Some growth, but are you seeing that there's going to be a continued uptick here as well?
Yeah, so music streaming is strong. So we're forecasting that in the South African market, that's going to almost double over the forecast period. So, people have got very used to obviously having access, right? So they've moved away from the digital downloads that we saw, take off a few years ago. So people have moved from ownership to access. And certainly, we saw some figures from Spotify a few months back in a report that they had released on the South African market. And in the last 5 years in South Africa, they have had around 1.4 billion hours of streaming content being consumed in the South African market. So streaming is going to continue to be very strong. People enjoy it. It obviously works on the move. It's relatively light on data, which obviously helps when you are under certain cost of living constraints. So we're not seeing any real slowdown in the streaming space. I think the big movement that we are seeing in the music space is obviously people continuing to return to live music as people enjoy getting back out there, obviously post-COVID, and really enjoying what they were used to, obviously, before we went into the pandemic period.
Yeah, and of course, Beyonce's Renaissance Tour is just one example of that. Stuart, finally, I'm interested to know about generative AI and the Metaverse. We've seen in Hollywood, it's been a huge topic of contention because of the fears that are associated with it. But broadly in the entertainment and media space, are there positive opportunities that generative AI and the Metaverse will play here in its growth?
Yeah, so you've touched on on let's call it the bit of anxiety, right, that AI created in Hollywood amongst the script writers. So certainly, I think we're in a period here, even in the Metaverse as well, where we are still really waiting to see exactly where this pans out. The Metaverse, obviously, we had a lot of excitement. It hasn't been all plain sailing. If we look into the US, for example, Meta had announced in terms of their Meta Reality Labs that in 2022 they lost $14 billion in terms of the financial results. We've seen layoffs of staff, across Meta and Microsoft in their Metaverse environment. So I think there's some time and some water that needs to flow under the bridge from a Metaverse perspective to see exactly where this ends up. But obviously, companies are taking a position, and we are seeing companies invest in the Metaverse, take up space, like we've seen obviously in our Ubuntu land in Africa Rare, in terms of our Africa Metaverse. So I think we are waiting to see where that sort of pans out. On the AI space, I think there are lots of use cases. It's probably the fastest adopted technology that we've seen, right? Certainly in terms of the technologies that we've been looking at. Now, exactly, again, where that's going to land, what the governance around AI is going to look like, we'll have to see how that pans out. It's exciting in terms of potentially being able to create a large volume of highly personalized, addressable content. So certainly we see some applications in the advertising space. But at the end of the day, obviously, your entertainment and media is a inherently creative industry at its core.
Yeah.
And AI can obviously learn, but does it have the same creativity that your traditional content creators have? Certainly, we're going to have to see how that pans out. But they certainly do look like there are a number of use cases, and we'll be monitoring that very closely over the years to come.
Stuart, thank you very much for those interesting insights. That is the big question, the creativity of the human brain as opposed to AI. These are developments we're going to continue to see unpack as we look at those developments. That is Charles Stuart from PwC South Africa's entertainment and media space there.